fandoms. So this is, you hear a lot about fandoms these days.
Yeah.
It mostly for negative.
Yeah.
Like the idea that there's been fandoms for a while, but it's sort of become, especially with the precursor of toxic, is usually how you hear fandom spoken of. Oftentimes as like placing the blame of Hollywood not being good on. It's not our fault that we made this bad movie.
Yeah.
It's the fans' fault for not liking our bad movie.
Yeah.
Like I know the most recent one that I can think of is like when Star Wars: The Acolyte was canceled. I know several of the cast or people involved were quick to be like, we made a good thing. It's just these toxic fans. Ignoring the fact that even the non-toxic fans apparently did not stream it because
very few fans, if any, streamed that one.
Yeah.
And so,
but it's just sort of being this what do we do with fandoms? Like they're everywhere, and I think even in broader sense than maybe, especially if you're maybe an older listener to this, beyond just the super geeks at Comic San Diego.
Yeah.
This fandoms are everywhere. There seems to be a lot of power, a lot of division, people fighting on social media. We just hear a lot about it. And I came across an article that I just found was interesting. This was published just a day or so ago. And I think whether you agree with him on everything or not, he touches on some interesting stuff about fandoms that I thought we could get into. So this is an article was written by Alan Moore. I don't know how familiar you are with him. He's kind of a legend in sort of that comic book, graphic novel industry.
Yeah, I'm not. I know some of the stuff he's written, but I'm not.
He did his probably the most famous Watchmen, kind of like the deconstructed superhero graphic novel. V for Vendetta. They made a movie. Batman: The Killing Joke, which is always elevated as one of the best Batman stories. So he's sort of been around, and he's a character. He often has an opinion. So so take it with maybe a grain of salt. But he wrote an article that I came across in The Guardian, which was titled "Fandom Has Toxified the World." Good clickbaity topic. It says, Watchmen author Alan Moore on superheroes, Comicsgate, and Trump. So there's maybe pull a couple quotes from this, and then we can kind of get into what he's saying, because I think he's touching on some interesting stuff. So in the article, he says, "I believe that fandom is a wonderful and vital organ of contemporary culture, without which that culture ultimately stagnates, apophyphizes, and dies. At the same time, I'm sure that fandom is sometimes a grotesque blight that poisons society surrounding it with its mean-spirited obsessions and ridiculous, unearned sense of entitlement." And he talks about how, as a young boy, he was very much into sort of the comic book fandom and how he found community there. But then he says, and when I look back, years later, after an internet and some few decades, fandom was a very different animal. An older animal, for one thing, with a median age in the late 40s, fed, presumably, by a nostalgia that its energetic predecessor was too young to suffer from. Says the boost in fandom's age and status possibly explains its current sense of privilege, its tendency to carp and curvail rather than to contribute and to create. It says, is this a case of those unwilling to outgrow childhood enthusiasms, possibly because these anchor them to a happier and less complex times, who now feel that they should be the sole arbiters of this pursuit? And kind of one of my big takeaways for this is he applies sort of that fandom culture in a broader sense to just life, and particularly in the realm of politics. It says, elections that decide the fate of millions are conducted in an atmosphere more suited to evictions on I'm a Celebrity, in which contestants who are insufficiently amusing are removed from office. Sellability, not substance, is the issue. And kind of the closing line for the article, he says, an enthusiasm that is fertile and productive can enrich life and society, just as displacing personal frustrations into venomous tirades about your boyhood hobby can devalue them. Quiet liking something is okay. You don't need the machete or the megaphone. So we both read this article, and I think it's interesting because in some sense he's reflecting on just fandoms, sort of very much rooted in pop culture and entertainment and the stories and the identity and sort of how that's how that's influenced just people growing up today. But then he also touches this on sort of this chicken and the egg thing of our fandoms today, sort of these toxic, very politicized thing, because of sort of the wider context of how we are in politics and we're divided? Or is it also true that politics and some of those kind of outside of the geekdom are the way they are and very toxic and divisive, and because they're reflecting sort of this fandom culture that has been kind of brewing for several decades. But what are your like initial takeaways from
Yeah.
his?
I mean, I feel like there's a bit of a confluence of a lot of different things happening. And I think it'd be really hard to sort of pin it down on one particular thing. I mean, I think one, obviously the internet is a big driver of both the good and the bad of fandoms, whether they're, really cool things can happen, but also really toxic things can happen. Um, and certainly social media. But then I think also, like, I think, just more broadly, there's more people, and I think maybe particularly men who are like aging up, but not really sort of moving out. And so there's that whole side of things. And then you have a media complex that, you know, they feed into this machine of politicians should be celebrities, and there's a likability factor versus like anything that any consideration of like their policies. Like, you don't hear people discussing like political policies anymore. It's all just like, this person's fun and energetic and this one's not, or I like how this person handles himself. And so yes, it's like, so I just think it's all of these different things kind of coming together where you have to unravel, I think, a lot of different things to try and get down at the heart of this, because I think it's both like people feeling a lost sense of purpose. Like, I think we are the most purposeless time, I think, because many people just, whether it's their careers or their families, they just, a lot of the traditional things that I think people have found purpose in, there's not. And there's fewer religious people. And so there's like this religious void in people's lives that I think fandom can kind of bring into. So I think there's all these different things that are happening that create the environment for these fandoms to be toxic and maybe not what they were back before the internet and before, when it was mostly maybe younger people and kids. And it's just a reluctance to grow out of that and to move on maybe in your taste and in your pursuits in life. Like,
Yeah, because I feel like I think he's right in the sense of, like, I think you can understand a lot about just sort of society and the way, a lot of the things that we maybe don't like about society
yeah,
by looking sort of through the lens of, not all fandom itself is not necessarily like an evil that poisons the world, like he's saying,
yeah,
but you do see some of those same tendencies definitely do bleed out. Like, I know, even just like we live in the Atlanta area, and like just within the last 3 days, like both of the presidential candidates were over here doing like rally. Like, we had to go, turn right instead of left out of church because, one of the candidates, I think Harris, was coming through, the main street, and like, you know, they're blocking off traffic, and like just on either one of those sides, like, those are essentially like Comic-Con for boomers, like, or for just all, like, it's, you got merch, like, you got they're very much like almost a reflection of like the old, like, Marvel versus DC. Like, it's sort of these two competing narratives, and then you have like the super fans that are very much like, gonna try and show their loyalty and kind of gatekeep. I'm more progressive than you are, I'm more conservative than you are, because I'm gonna even say this. And like, so many of the things you sort of see that makes, like, geek fandoms toxic, very much is like, I think he's right to say, like, it's not just about, like, fandoms are not just those like 35-year-old Star Wars geeks that are mad about The Last Jedi. Like,
yeah,
I think some of those tendencies very much do filter out. So a couple of things about fandom. I do think it's clear, at least for us to establish, before anyone gets mad at us, that I don't think fandoms are bad. Like, I don't think like being like an avid, very enthusiastic fan of something, like, I think that's actually a good thing. Like, I think we should be fan. You know what? We don't want a world of just apathetic people. I know I've shared here before. This is my official card, the Tolkien Society membership card, because I am in fact a card-carrying member of the J.R.R. Tolkien Society. So I'm speaking of someone that's like, I'm very much within a fandom. Like, I love Lord of the Rings stuff. I buy the merch. Like, I'm in it. Like, I'm, and I don't know if you're into weird farming fandoms or the stuff that you're into, but I think like finding a community of people that that are like-minded and share. Like, there's a lot of value in that, especially in a time that maybe we are more like spread apart and distant. Like, gravitating towards people that actually care about the things you care about.
Yeah.
And I'm part of like some heavy metal Reddit pages, and I think there's value in that. I think more what Alan Moore is getting at. I think more the part that I would agree more of is more that like fandom culture, not just like he's not really saying like being a fan of Marvel or Star Wars, poisons society. Like, that's not really what he's saying. Like,
yeah.
I think it's more just sort of this fandom culture, this kind of like emotionally putting so much of your own like identity into some thing. And sort of this like sense of entitlement that creates of like, I put so much of myself into this that like in return, they owe me like in equal measure, like my identity is based around this. Like, you need to deliver and like give me exactly, like I grew up, I bought all the Star Wars toys, I read all the Legends books. Like, therefore, like you need to make Star Wars movies that perfectly align with my own because I've been there for the long haul. Like, I think that's sort of more I think what he's pushing back about. Like,
yeah.
Do you agree with that or?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's the thing that I think maybe ties more into the religious void that has been left for a lot of people. And I think like those people who feel that entitlement, I think are the ones who are the most like orthodox about whatever fandom they're involved in. And you just see like there's so much like energy put into these fandoms that it is I think very close to like religious organizations in some way. It has sort of replaced maybe even the role of religion in maybe a very like self-serving kind of way. It's like you can get into all these things, but it ultimately comes back down to like it's about me because like I have chosen to be a super fan of this thing, and therefore like I have some pull in what they do next, or they should consider my opinion, because you can give your opinion about your fandoms now to the world. It does create, I think that's where it starts to get toxic, is when you start to say like, yeah, this, you owe this to me, or like, because I've been a fan since the beginning, or because I've done the most fan things, then I feel my opinion about, your next movie should be weighted heavier than it is, and so it creates some really weird, and I do think toxic atmospheres.
Yeah, and I think you're right. And we've talked about this before. Like, in many ways, fandoms become these like quasi-religious communities. Like, not in like a very like explicit sense of like, you go to the Church of Marvel or something.
No,
but in the sense that like, there is this need to like direct our enthusiasm, our reverence, or whatever, like, our like, innate desire to worship like, towards something, and then like sort of establish a community around that. Like, you have sort of the prophets, the teacher, the gurus and stuff that within all these communities, and like you have sort of the sacred text, the orthodoxy, and you sort of even see that with like in my own fandom of like Lord of the Rings, with like the Rings of Power. I'm like, well, this is sort of outside of, or this is apocryphal, like this isn't Tolkien stuff, and if you don't hate the show, then like you're not really a true devotee of Tolkien. Because, and you sort of have all these sort of, like, I think almost as a Christian, you have insight into like some of the fandom like toxicity makes more sense, because you realize like if you see it through the lens of like worship and religion and like spirituality, then like you see where a lot like the roots of a lot of those things. So it's an interesting article. We'll link that in the description below, because even if you don't agree with with him on this particular thing, I do think he's at least asking some interesting questions, and I think kind of bringing in that fandom discussion to look at the rest of the world, I think can be valuable. But speaking of